Tonight, John Ankerberg examines the views of secular humanism and compares them with the views of Orthodox Christianity. John's guest representing secular humanism is Dr. Paul Kurtz, author of the Humanist Manifesto II and a Secular Humanist Declaration. Dr. Kurtz is also the editor of The Free Inquiry, the main secular humanist magazine in America. He is also professor of philosophy at State University of New York at Buffalo. John's second guest is Dr. Norman Geisler, professor of philosophy and theology at Dallas Theological Seminary. Dr. Geisler is the author of more than 20 books on philosophy and theology, including the book, Is Man the Measure? An Evaluation of Contemporary Secular Humanism. In Program 1, both sides will discuss, does today's scientific evidence for the origin of the universe point people to secular humanism or biblical Christianity? In Program 2, which view best encompasses the scientific evidence for the origin of first life on the earth? In Program 3, are secular humanists threatening the academic freedom of American schools when they advocate laws that will only allow teachers to present secular humanist views when they forbid teachers to present scientific facts that might disprove humanist theories? In Program 4, are secular humanists right or wrong in stating there is insufficient evidence that Jesus Christ is God? In Program 5, can the secular humanist rationally justify why he is a moral person when he does not believe God exists? And in Program 6 and 7, both sides will respond to questions from the audience. We invite you to hear these discussions.
Welcome. We're talking tonight about secular humanism. Is there any rational justification for being a humanist? And is it more or less rational for a person to hold a biblical Christian beliefs? My guests are Dr. Paul Kurtz, the man who drafted the Humanist Manifesto II, and a Secular Humanist Declaration. He's also the editor of the main secular humanist magazine in America entitled Free Inquiry. He's also professor of philosophy at the State University of New York at Buffalo. And also, my second guest, Dr. Norman Geisler, an Orthodox Christian scholar, professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, the author of many books on philosophy and theology. Tonight we want to talk about secular humanists' view of God. And in the Humanist Declaration, Paul, we find these statements that you say, secular humanists, we find that traditional views of the existence of God either are meaningless, have not yet been demonstrated to be true. Secular humanists find insufficient evidence for the claim that some divine purpose exists for the universe. They reject the idea that God has intervened miraculously in history or revealed himself to a chosen few or that he can save or redeem sinners. We reject the divinity of Jesus. We do not accept as true the literal interpretation of the Old and New Testaments. Now, along with this, in the magazine that you're the editor of, Free Inquiry, I believe this was the last one out, wasn't it, Winter? That I was really appalled here, Paul, that you have a deal, was Jesus a God? And the statement that's made in here, Jesus nowhere claims to be a God in the New Testament. Paul, you really want to go with that?
Who is that article by, John?
Tom Franzik.
I see, yes. Well, the question, you're raising the question, is Jesus the Son of God? Is he divine? What's the evidence for that?
Yeah. First of all, though, I looked at this article and I just had to say that most Christians that have opened their Bible and looked at it would say, this guy couldn't find any verses. He says, nowhere did Jesus claim to be a God.
Yes.
I never checked out Mark 2, never checked out the book of John, where even the enemies of Jesus said, he being a man makes himself out to be a God. Or Jesus said, to prove that I have authority on earth to forgive sins,
I don't
he did
necessarily
something.
agree with Tom Franzik in that article. Being the editor of a journal, I don't agree with everything that I publish in the journal.
Glad to hear that.
But in any case, I don't think there's sufficient evidence to say that Jesus was divine. To take it to that point, because I don't take the Bible as divinely inspired. I think the Bible is a human document like the Koran, like the Book of Mormon, and that these were written by primitive people, the Bible over 1,000 years on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. And I don't think that the claims of revelation or miracles, as you read in the Bible, can be supported by the evidence. That's why I'm a skeptic about the divinity of Jesus.
Okay, you don't think there's enough evidence concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, supported by the historical documents of the New Testament, to give probability historically that Jesus is God?
The answer to that is no. Now, I'm not a biblical scholar, That's not my field, biblical criticism, so I will speak as a philosopher. I find that the New Testament, the four Gospels of the New Testament, as far as I can tell, were not written by eyewitnesses. They were written by people who themselves did not know Jesus directly, neither Paul nor Mark or the other authors of the Gospel.
Then you're not familiar with William F. Albright, Johns Hopkins, who said before he died that every one of the books of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the time of 40 to 80 A.D., probably somewhere between 50 to 75?
Yes, granted, after the death of Jesus. Yes, but did not know him directly. They were written...
well, they would all still be alive. They would have been contemporaries of Jesus if it was written in that time period.
If Jesus had died, we're not certain, somewhere about 30 A.D., then the books of the New Testament were written from 20 to 30 to 50 years after his death.
Okay, you don't know of any evidence there. Dr. Geisler, you've written about 20 books on that topic, so give us a little evidence in terms of from history and any way you want to go on that one.
Well, very simple. Let's start at the top. Jesus did claim to be God. He said, I and the Father are one. They took up stones to stone him. He said he forgives sins. They said, who can forgive sins but God only? He said, before Abraham was, I am. Anybody who looks seriously at the New Testament knows that Jesus claimed to be God. Then he offered three proofs. He fulfilled prophecy made hundreds of years in advance. He lived a sinless, miraculous life. He predicted and accomplished his resurrection from the dead. No one in history has made those claims and offered that evidence and pulled it off. There are more historical documents that verify the New Testament as being authentic. There are 5,366 Greek manuscripts alone that verify the New Testament, say nothing of 15,000 other copies that go right back to the threshold of the first century. It was written by eyewitness contemporaries of the events. His resurrection was witnessed by over 500 people, Paul said most of whom are still alive. There's more evidence that Jesus lived, claimed to be God, and proved it than there is that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. So if the skeptic wants to be skeptical and wipe out the New Testament, he has to wipe out ancient history too, for which there's less evidence.
Well, I didn't realize we were going to argue the Bible because I'm not a biblical scholar. So
that's just part of the Humanist Manifesto, large chapters there.
I have to bring what I've read on this as best. I've read the Bible many, many times, but I'm not a minister of the cloth. But let me speak as a skeptic and as a non-believer. As far as I can tell, there's no independent confirmation from sources outside the Gospels written at that time.
Careful, Paul.
The Gospels were written by propagandists for the faith, people
Paul,
who believed,
you don't want to really say
believed in Christianity, and they were not.
Paul, you're proving that you're not a scholar in this area, Paul, because there's just too much evidence. Let me go this way. I gotta nail you down here. You have a quote in one of your books that you say we have got to base our conclusions on evidence. And you say we will follow those conclusions right to the end, no matter where they lead us. Now, here's my little question before I ask Geisler to give us a little evidence. If we show you the evidence, will you change your mind?
I would, but I've looked at the evidence. I've read everything I can about it, and the more I read, I have been reading the Bible. I wish I'd read the Bible more intensively when I was younger. I'd be a stronger atheist than I am now. but on this point,
Paul, let's answer
on this point.
Let's answer your question then concerning what you said there, concerning the sources as well as.
Are there sources outside the Gospels?
Okay, Dr. Geisler, what about that? You've written one big whole 500-page book on that topic. Give us a few shreds of evidence there.
611 pages.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry. Well, first of all, look what he's saying. He's saying, take a courtroom scene and pretend he's one of the attorneys, and he's saying, now look, Geisler, apart from your eyewitnesses, you have a pretty poor case, don't you? I mean, of course, the eyewitnesses are in the New Testament.
Who are the eyewitnesses? None of them were contemporaneous. Mark didn't know Jesus, nor did Luke, Matthew, or John.
Matthew was a disciple. He spent 3.5 years with Jesus. I imagine he knew him quite well. Mark was probably the young man in the Gospel of Mark the End. He was a secretary and assistant of Peter, who was an apostle. He was a contemporary of Christ. Luke he was a contemporary and looked into the sources. He was a doctor, a historian that Ramsey showed that was accurate in everything he could check on, and was a skeptic before he checked out Luke. John was an eyewitness. The Apostle Paul was an eyewitness. All of them were eyewitnesses.
How is Apostle Paul an eyewitness? Did he know Jesus?
Yes, he certainly did. He knew Jesus, and he was a witness of the resurrection. And he lists himself in 1 Corinthians 15 as one of the witnesses of the resurection because Christ appeared to him. In fact, Christ
appeared to him on the road to Damascus, but he said this was an uncorroborated observation. But he did not know Jesus at the time that Jesus was alive, as far as I can tell.
He most certainly did, because if he appeared to him on the road to Damascus, that was only a short time after
the death of Jesus.
And Paul was
but they also preached.
But I didn't know. Look, there is a body of biblical criticism which denies that Matthew was an apostle of Jesus, and denies that any of the other three writers of the Gospels knew Jesus. Now, you're differing with that interpretation.
Well, Paul,
at least it's an arguable question. There are people who maintain that the authors were of the second generation and were not contemporaneous with
Well, put
Jesus.
it this way. There were people who believed that. That's a pre-archaeological point of view. But most scholars, even rabid scholars like Robinson, the Death of God scholar J. Robinson, who wrote a book redating the New Testament, in which he says all the basic Gospels were written between 45 and 65 during the life of the eyewitness, and he didn't even believe in the existence of God, so he didn't have any axe to grind. That was a view, but it's archaeological curiosity now rather than really a serious scholarly view.
Okay, then let's
deny
move on.
that point. There are serious scholars who dissent with your interpretation.
But there's also a lot of what he's saying, archaeological data. Plus, when we were talking about in the documents themselves, if you remember, if you read the book of Acts, where Paul himself on trial before Agrippa points to Agrippa and says, you know of the things that I'm talking about because these things weren't hidden, they weren't done in a corner. Even he was preaching to other people that were eyewitnesses.
He mentions 500 people having seen the resurrection of Christ. We have no statement of the 500 people. I mean, this is uncorroborated testimony given by people who are creating a new religion. It would not hold up in a court of law. Most of the Gospels are contradictory on many points. As I read the Gospels side by side, I find that they contradict each other on very important
three things
points.
out there. Let's take them one at a time. Uncorroborated testimony. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, James. That's hardly uncorroborated. You got in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word shall be established. So you've got corroborated testimony. Secondly, they were eyewitness testimony. Thirdly, there aren't any contradictions. There are alleged contradictions in the gospel, and the alleged contradictions actually argue for the authenticity of the witnesses because they called it as they saw it. They didn't get together and try and put this thing together, and you get that type of thing when you get independent testimonies.
Well, if you read the resurrection, as I read the 4 parts side by side, in one case you have, let's see if I can reconstruct, you have a youth dressed in white. You have two angels, first inside the tomb and then outside the tomb. You have different reports. I suggest that anyone who wants to have an open mind about this, read the 4 Gospels side by side, and the eyewitnesses differ on that point.
Well, I have read the 4 Gospels, and I read that point, and there's nothing contradictory that either you pointed out or that can be pointed out in that record. Sure, you had 2 angels, and sure they were in the tomb once, and sure they were outside, but that's not a contradiction.
Well, but you have if you have an accident or if you have a crime and you have witnesses, and if your witnesses give different testimony, what are you to make about this?
You're to assume that if their testimony differs,
testimony does differ.
Independent testimony, and that's the kind of thing that actually argues for the authenticity of it. And to bring out the other point you made, that it wouldn't stand up in a court of law. As a matter of fact, the professor of Harvard University of Law a number of years ago, Simon Greenleaf, was challenged on that very point. Now, he wrote the book on legal evidence used by lawyers to test these things in court. And they challenged him to apply that same logic to the New Testament and see what he'd conclude. Here's what he concluded. New Testament documents are authentic. The witnesses are reliable. Jesus Christ really rose from the dead. You ought to read it. The testimony of the evangelist, Simon Greenleaf.
Well, let me jump to the next topic because we only got a few minutes. Right. What do you think about the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead?
Well, how many witnesses were there for that? Why did not Jesus appear to non-Christians?
How about Thomas? Was he a Christian? He says, I won't believe.
Well, he was a doubter, but he was one of the disciples.
Well, he's like you then,
but why didn't Jesus appear in Rome, or why didn't he come before Pontius Pilate?
Well, you asked me, and I just gave you an example, and he did.
He only appears to the people who believe in him. This is an article of faith.
Again, did Thomas believe in him? He says, I won't believe unless I check out the empirical data.
He only Well, this is written after the fact. What the facts are, we don't know. They're trying to convince people to accept Christianity. Much the same as the Koran. Do you accept the Koran? Would you go through the evidence for the Koran? There are 800 million Mohammedans today. You can raise the same thing about whether or not Muhammad's view is reliable, or whether Joseph Smith in the Book of the Mormon.
He didn't claim to be God and offer this proof. And besides that, there are two other people who weren't believers that Jesus did appear to. His brothers, James and Jude, weren't believers. He appeared to both of them after his resurrection.
This is hearsay.
So he did appear. Well, the eyewitnesses are the ones who heard it and saw it, and they said it. If that's hearsay,
well,
then,
it's like reading. It's like reading books by a disciple of Reverend Moon. Now, a lot of people today are very critical about Reverend Moon. Do you go to the Unification Church to find out what Moon believes and what he does not believe and what he did and did not
if
have?
I followed your
no,
logic,
you'd be very
Paul,
cautious about reading what Reverend Moon wrote. You'd read about what other people in the context at that time wrote. All that you have are the Christian
Paul.
documents.
Careful, because I've had the key spokesman for Reverend Moon on the program, and so I've done all the research. So let's not bring that up too far.
If anyone who saw the events is disqualified, and anyone who believes it is disqualified, then you should never read a book by any evolutionist and accept any scientific fact in that book, because he has an axe to grind.
Well, the point is, I don't take the New Testament as scientific fact. I think it's an expression of belief. It's a product of an oral tradition. The stories probably change. It's based upon hearsay, second-hand and third-hand testimony. It's not direct testimony that can be interpreted in historical terms.
What we just showed you was first-hand eyewitness testimony, for which there are more manuscripts, more witnesses, more cross-checks, archaeologically supported than any book from the ancient world. So you just, again, wiped out all of ancient
Let me
history.
suggest that there's a literature of biblical criticism that goes back at least 2 centuries, and there are a number of scholars who denied every point.
Do you know where that started? That criticism started? It started with Benedict Spinoza in 1670 in his book Theological Tractatus. Benedict Spinoza was a pantheist naturalist who didn't believe in miracles, and because of his rationalism and anti-supernaturalism, he assumed those miracles didn't happen.
In the 19th
and
century,
modern criticism sprang from that,
which is
built
independent,
on an anti-supernatural bias.
I say, go to the Bible, read it with a scientific, open, objective mind. Do not read it through the eyes of faith. Read it as you read any other book. And if you read it as you read any other book, then doubts do creep in on this point.
I would say just the opposite. Go to the Bible with an open mind. Say, what are they saying? Whom are they saying it about? And ask yourself the question, is it true? Is there evidence for it? And you will conclude that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Frank Morrison did. He was a skeptic. He did the same thing, and he wrote a book, Who Moved the Stone, showing how when he looked at it that way, he was converted. Sir William Ramsay did it. Lord Lyttelton did it. Simon Greenleaf. It happened to skeptic after skeptic. And I suggest if you do it, it might even happen to you.
I have done it. I have done it, and I've reached the opposite conclusion, and many other people have done it and have reached the opposite conclusion at the same time.
You couldn't have done it very carefully in view of what you just told us before.
I think I did it as carefully as I could.
You didn't know what it said. So I suggest you might try and refresh your memory on it a little bit and give it a chance, because the Bible says you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. You're interested in freedom as a humanist, and I suggest that you can get true freedom through Jesus Christ. You're interested in freedom as a humanist, and I suggest that you can get true freedom through Jesus Christ.
Well, it's a very nice sermon, and it may be true, but I think that the Bible ought to be reread today. I think it's important that people read the Bible freshly and independently without any theological bias, and I think you ought to read it in the light of archaeology and read it in the light of philology and linguistics and other scientific endeavors at the same time. Read it in the same way you read the Koran.
That's right.
And be skeptical.
And the Koran does. Why do you add and be skeptical? Read it and be open to the evidence.
Be open.
Don't read it with a bias against it. Read it and be open to the evidence. I look at the Koran, I've read it, and I'm open. Well, Muhammad claimed to be a prophet.
Okay.
He didn't claim to be God. Muhammad didn't die and rise from the dead. He didn't claim to.
He claimed that he had
fulfill prophecy.
He claimed that he had a visitation.
He
claimed that you're really closed-minded and biased about the Quran. You should have an open mind about it.
That's what it says.
He claimed to have had a visitation from Gabriel in the cave at Hirja, north of Mecca. He was the only one that had this visitation from Gabriel. Was uncorroborated. On the basis of that, he gave these marvelous statements that became the Koran. And there's something like 1 1 billion Mohammedans in the world who now accept the Quran as true.
And
now,
Paul, could I jump in right there? The thing is, if you got two competing world systems like
yes.
Muslim religion and the Christian religion, in the Quran, Muhammad is told to repent 7 times. You also have the fact that in the Quran, Jesus Christ, it was said he didn't die on the cross and he didn't come forth from the dead. Christianity says he did die on the cross and he did come forth from the dead. One or the other is right. They both can't be right at the same time, saying contradictory things. Now, how would you come to a conclusion which one is right?
Well, the question is, what is the evidence for the resurrection? It may have been that Jesus did, if Jesus existed, some people have denied that he existed, but I assume that he did. If he existed, he may not have died on the cross. He may only have swooned. He may have been taken into the cave and then disappeared, and not necessarily had been resurrected.
Dr. Geisler,
not necessarily had died.
Well, the swoon theory is long since swooned, but Jesus did die on the cross. We know it because he was on the cross from 9 o'clock in the morning till just before sunset. He had 5
6 hours.
wounds. He was on the cross from 9 o'clock. I know you have to read it again, because if you don't know that, he was on at 9 o'clock in the morning. Read Mark's account and you'll see. He had wounds in his hands, wounds in his feet. They put a spear in his side. He gave a death cry. He said he was dying. The Roman soldiers verified his death. He was wound up in 100 pounds of spices and things, and put in a grave, and was there, and it was sealed up. If ever anyone was dead, he was dead.
Pontius Pilate was surprised when they heard he was dead.
Why
he double-checked it, in fact.
No.
He double-checked it to make sure, after all of that, on top of it. And Jesus Christ rose. So read Stroud's book on the physiological causes of Christ's death. If you ever had an infallible proof from a distance that Jesus died because of the blood and water that came out of his side, you have it in that book. And if you're open-minded, I suggest you take a look at it.
Well, there are other people who have suggested that we don't have sufficient evidence to say that he did die, that he may merely have fainted and risen in the tomb
Anybody
and then left.
Anything, but the evidence shows
what would be sufficient evidence, Paul?
Well, I think sufficient evidence would be by not necessarily propagandists, but by objective or impartial people. The problem is that this is long far gone. It's very difficult now to corroborate these facts. The claims that are made are claims that are made against natural events. Now, usually if people do die, usually they do not come back to life. Therefore, if we were to accept the fact of resurrection, then we would need very strong evidence indeed, and not merely the evidence as a product of an oral tradition that is passed down by religion. We would need corroboration. I don't think we have that in regard to the
We've got about 2 minutes left, Norman.
Well, we now have corroboration. We have numerous witnesses who saw him on at least 10 different occasions over a 40-day period of time. They stuck their finger in his hand. They stuck their hand in his side. He ate fish. They felt his flesh and bones. He taught them. He performed miracles. He transformed them from cowards to courageous men who went out and preached the resurrection and converted the very people in the very city, in the very area in which this had all happened, not hundreds of years later, but just 40 days later. That's good evidence.
All right, we're going to come back next week. We're going to have question and answers from the audience. I hope that you'll join us. We'll continue on secular humanism.